Welcome to the Up Arrow Podcast with William Harris, featuring top business leaders sharing strategies and resources to get to the next level. Now, let's get started with the show.
Hey everyone, I'm William Harris. I'm the founder and CEO of Element and the host of the Up Arrow Podcast, where I feature the best minds in e-commerce to help you scale from 10 million to 100 million and beyond as you up arrow your business and your personal life. Joining me today is Jeremiah Prummer. Jeremiah is the founder and CEO of KnoCommerce, which works with some of the best brands online, including Hexclad, Brewmate, and True Classic. He's been an entrepreneur since 2010 and initially got his start in e-commerce building WooCommerce extensions. He sold to Tiny in 2022 and now operates under the umbrella of a public holding company. Jeremiah, it's been a long time coming. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks, man. It's good to see you. And yeah, it has been a long time. I don't even know how long we've been, messaging each other on Twitter and interacting with each other's content and stuff, but it's been years, I feel like.
Exactly. And I was going to say, I was trying to think if we met through anybody, and I don't think it was. I think we literally just started engaging on Twitter, which has become a theme for a lot of these where I'm like, we didn't meet through anybody other than just engage with each other's stuff.
Yeah, which is awesome. I mean, I guess it all kind of starts somewhere, right? Like,
Totally.
I know Andrew Foxwell. I don't know.
Yep.
Okay, so anyway, we'll give Andrew a little shout out here. I know, at some point years ago, I was engaging with Andrew's content, and I'm sure that's probably how all of it started. So
Sure. Yeah, Andrew's a good guy. Again, I've known him for years as well, and definitely worth giving him a shout out.
He deserves
So
it.
today we are going to be talking about going beyond demographics and how to scale profits using some next level customer insights. Before we do that, I do want to mount our sponsor real quick. This episode is brought to you by Element. Element is an award-winning advertising agency optimizing e-commerce campaigns around profit. In fact, we've helped 13 of our customers get acquired, with the largest one selling for nearly $800 million and one that IPO'd recently. You can learn more on our website at element.com, which is spelled ELUMYNT.com. That said, enough of that stuff. On to the good stuff. Again, talking about beyond demographics, scaling profits using next level customer insights with Jeremiah Prummer. So Jeremiah, okay, what is the biggest problem with customer service? Like, what are we doing wrong?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I would say the biggest problem with customer service in general is that brands just aren't asking enough questions, and I think part of that comes down to the fact that there's you have to have a strategy, right? So like,
Sure.
What questions do I ask? What do I do with the information once I get that information, right? And I think one of the things that we see as a theme in our business is that customers want to give their feedback. And I think we see this in the context of reviews, right? But I think what the challenge with a review, and the reason why reviews actually have a much lower response rate than a survey, is that a review is going to be posted publicly. And it's also kind of a constricted format, right? You're basically being asked, like, tell us on a scale of 1 to 5, essentially, is usually the scale that we're using, how we did. And I think that just feels a little bit more burdensome. Oftentimes it's coming in a form where you need to click through an email, you need to go through, you need to fill out a form, maybe you have to log in for it. Like that format is more challenging. And so what we see is that we survey mostly from an order confirmation screen, or the second most common way that somebody will deliver a survey is via an email, where as soon as you click the button, you're in the survey taking process and you're going through and answering those questions. And then we obviously have people who are just embedding a survey on their site as well, right? And so there's something about that process where, because you just instantly get into the flow of answering questions, and the questions are different than a review question, it just lends itself to more responses. So we see much higher response rates with these things. And so that's one piece of it, is just like that format, I think, is different, the survey format versus something like a review. And then the problem in that context, though, is we see so many people just not asking enough questions. And there's kind of two different things that I think about here. One is there's a lot of brands will go and they'll create a long form survey for their customers to try to understand, maybe once or twice a year, they make this really long survey, and it's 20, 30, 40 questions long. And there's a ton of thought that goes into it. There's a ton of time spent crafting these questions. Maybe you're going to give out some sort of reward for taking that survey. And that ends up being a very large project, right? Somebody's spending a lot of time on that. And because it's a large project, it's also kind of daunting. So you look at this and you're like, I've got to put all this time, all this thought, all this effort into crafting this perfect survey. And so that's kind of one end of the spectrum. And then the other end of the spectrum is somebody says, well, I just want to know how somebody said that they found me. And so I'm going to drop a single question survey on my order confirmation screen, and I'm just going to collect that data. And so there's advantages and disadvantages to both, right? Like if you're just asking that one question, the barrier to entry on that is next to nothing. Like you don't have to put a lot of thought into it. Somebody else has already told you this is a good question to ask. You already have an idea of like what you can do with that information, right? It's extremely simple. And so there's it's very easy. And then on the other side, you've got actually probably way more insight, way more robust and meaningful data that you're collecting if you're asking 20 questions. But if you have to put a lot of thought and effort into it, you just might not do it. And so I think there's a balance there. And so what we recommend to brands is basically like, hey, get in here, start asking some questions. You're going to see a lot of people answering these questions. If you're, let's say you're showing a survey on an order confirmation screen, a typical response rate's around 40%. So 40% of your customers are going to answer that survey. And so that's a really good sample size. Don't just ask one question, ask 3 or 5 or 10 questions. We have a bunch of pre-built questions we recommend, or you can even go look at what other brands are doing with this. And just don't be afraid to ask questions, because people do want to give their feedback. And that's just kind of a common trend we see among consumers, is they do like to be able to give feedback.
That's fair. As human beings in general, we like to give feedback. So, things like what's your third favorite vegetable or seventh favorite color, things like it, just keep going on and on with the questions, right? No, I see the point that you're driving. Perfectionism on the one side, minimalism on the other side. That's not the right amount. So we need to get to more questions than what people are typically asking. How many questions are we talking? Are we talking, hey, this should be 3, 5, 500? Like where do we draw the line?
Yeah. So it's all about your business goals, right?
Sure.
The reality is the more questions you ask, the less likely somebody is to complete all those questions. So sure. If you're using a kind of an old school survey solution, that is a problem. So let's say you're using like a type form where you have a 10 question survey, somebody has to answer all 10 questions and all of those are submitted together as a group. You're going to get a lower response rate if you ask 10 questions than if you ask 2. And that means you're going to collect less data. But in the context of what we do, we collect every single question response. So if you ask 10 questions and somebody answers 2 of the 10, you get those 2 responses. If somebody else answers 7, you get those 7 responses. And then, of course, if somebody answers all 10, you get all 10. So I think the way that I look at it is ask as many questions as you're going to use. So whatever, if you have a plan for what to do with that data, then ask the question. There's no issues with going deep and long form. We have some brands we work with that are running 20 plus question surveys on an order confirmation screen. And actually, one of the brands we work with, they're mid 9 figures, great brand. And they do this really well, I feel like. So they ask their attribution questions, which is what they care about most for new customers. They ask, how did you first hear about us? What brought you to our site today? Follow-up questions based on, if somebody says they saw them on TV, they're asking what were you watching? If, just different questions like that. And then they ask, how long did you know about us before placing your first purchase? And it's basically a set of 5-ish questions that somebody might answer. And then they have a pause, and it's basically just we call them an action card or like an HTML card in there where you can choose to continue. And so they say, hey, we have some more questions for you if you're willing to answer these additional questions. And so it's literally like a pause in the survey. You don't have to do that, but in this case they do, and I think it's smart. And so if somebody says next, then they end up going through this flow of answering. It's like 15 additional questions. It's a massive number of questions. And I think that's a really smart way of doing it. They're gathering the data that they want to up front. They're making sure they get the most important information for them. And then after the fact, they're collecting other information that they'll use, demographics data, understanding purchase intent data, asking their customers what other types of products they'd like to see from them, what other brands they're shopping, all of these kinds of pieces of information that are not as critical, because the most important thing to them is understanding the the impact of their ad spend when they're spending. I don't know how much they spend, but I'm guessing it's 100 million plus a year in ads, on paid ads. And so that's the most impactful thing for them. But all of that other data is still valuable, and there are a subset of their customers who want to answer those questions.
Yeah, I like that. You know who Nate Bargatze is, the comedian?
Oh, sorry, I missed that.
No. Do you know who Nate Bargatze is, the comedian?
Oh no, I don't think I do.
Okay. He has a bit that I appreciate that talks about how it's like he would read more, but he's like, every page it's just like the most words possible. And he was like, just let me just put a few blank pages in there so I can come up for air and breathe a little bit. I feel like that's kind of like what those cards are in the middle, where it's like, it can feel that way when you're just like question. You're like, whoa, let me breathe. Yep. Maybe I will answer some questions, but give me a chance to just catch up here a little bit.
Yeah. It's awesome. I think it's a really smart way of doing it.
Yeah. So you were talking to me before about asking questions along the customer journey, which I thought was a really good way of looking at this. So if we're saying, okay, let's ask more questions, well, what questions should we ask? Where should we be asking those questions? How does the customer journey, like what points in this journey are you asking, and what are the kinds of questions you'd be asking?
Yeah, it's a good question. It kind of depends on the size of your brand and what your objectives are, right? In terms of what the best question set is. But I'll use an example of a brand that's doing, let's say, 5 to 50 million a year in revenue, and they are really focused on scaling their business, and they're also focused on building out the retention side of their business. So, and obviously all businesses want to do that, but I think that in terms of where you put your time and attention, that's the size at which like you can actually start to look at both those things simultaneously and dedicate resources to them. So in that context, a new customer might get a survey that's focused on discovery and attribution. You want to know how they found your brand. You want to know who they're purchasing for. You want to know why they purchased. I think that's another really valuable piece of information too. Understanding the motivation of the buyer, and is that different between somebody who found you on TikTok versus somebody who found you on Facebook, right? And it could be because it's probably different target audiences that you're hitting, or at least it could be. And so that's a really good starting point, is to say, okay, if somebody has never purchased from me before, I'm going to ask them these questions, and it's going to be really focused on how do I find more people like this, and how do I know which of these people are the most valuable long-term, short and long-term to my business. And then if somebody has purchased before, then maybe you want to ask them a different set of questions. So asking them questions about what other products would you like to see from us? So kind of that product innovation side of things. Maybe even getting super specific, saying, hey, we're looking at launching, one of these 5 items in the next quarter. Are there any of these that you're interested in? And then if somebody says yes to, I'll use a sparkling water brand we work with as an example. When somebody says, yes, I want your ginger flavor, then you tag that person in Klaviyo or whatever ESP you're using, and then you now have the ability to send an email to that person. So you're kind of expanding that the data that you have about that customer who's been buying from you. At that point, you're also going to know where they discovered you, what motivates them to buy, all these kinds of things. So you're kind of building a data set on that person. So those are the types of questions I'd ask there. Site usability issues, like that's another one that's really interesting. And that could be new customer or returning customer survey, but I love asking those kinds of questions. So I think that's kind of like the simplest way to look at it, is breaking down those two cohorts. The other things I like to look at are things like abandoned cart surveys. So if somebody didn't finish purchasing, let's drop a survey in the abandoned cart flow. So don't make it the first email you send. That first one should be focused on getting the purchase, right? But if you send 2 or 3 emails and somebody's not buying, maybe switch your call to action to a tell us why. Let them fill out a little survey. And then what you can do in that survey I'm sure you can do this in some capacity with other solutions too, but in ours specifically, we have what we call actions. And so you can actually use basically depending on what somebody answers, you can give them different information. So we have a brand we work with. They sell smoke bombs. And so it's a hazardous material. The shipping price is $45 I forget the exact amount, but something like that, $45 for shipping. there's no way that you can change that. There's no cheaper shipping option. That's just how it is.
Sure.
And so you see all these people come in and they're like, okay, I just spent $20 on smoke bombs, but shipping is $45. And so as you can imagine, there's a lot of abandoned carts in that context, even though it's written all over their website. I think they even mention their ad sometimes, their abandoned cart email, the first one they send out mentions it, but people still miss that. And so when you can ask somebody, why didn't you buy? And they say, shipping price was too high. You already know that's an objection, but it gives you the ability to then tell them in that context why the shipping price is so high. Remind them of that, right? If somebody says that the price of the product is too high, maybe you want to give them a 10% discount code and get them to go straight to your site to purchase. If the product they wanted is out of stock, maybe you want to trigger an email from Klaviyo, connect them to your customer service, and find out which product they want, right? So like there's all kinds of things that you can do in that context as well. So I love that. So we got new customer survey, returning customer survey, abandoned cart survey, and then just like some general life cycle sort of surveys can be helpful. So depending on your brand, like if you're a supplement brand, maybe you want to ask a set of questions on order number 1 to understand why somebody's purchasing your product, what kind of symptoms they're having, what's the level of the symptoms. I've seen this work really well with like menstrual cycle products. So there's a lot of menstruation products out there. And so you already know why somebody's buying your product. It's very obvious, right? So asking somebody like for what, even just a question on like on a scale of 1 to 10, what are your symptom levels? And there's probably a better way of phrasing that, but you ask them on order number 1, and then you ask them on order number 3 and order number 6, and you see, is this changing for them over time? And then you actually have hard data to back it up, that your customers say like, hey, on average, our customers were a 7 out of 10 in terms of discomfort scale, and they're now a 4 out of 10 6 months later. Like that kind of data can be really valuable. So so many of those things like a new customer survey, returning customer survey, I'd say every brand just implement that. It's really easy to do. Provides a ton of value and gives you a ton of information. But there's so many other things like a survey around the a monthly cycle that is going to be very specific to a specific brand. And so in that context, like you have to also think through, what problems is your brand solving? What types of emotions are you hoping to elicit from your customers? And then think about how that fits into your survey process. That's obviously easier said than done, right? This is where going back to that idea of like, it's really easy to turn on a single question survey versus running a 20 question survey that I have to put a lot of thought and effort into. So I'm not saying like start with that from day one, but those are the types of things that I look at over time.
There are so many good things that you shared there that I didn't want to interrupt you. But I have some follow-ups on some of that stuff there too. That I appreciate. One is I love that you called out how learning this information can help you make sure that you're doing a better job delivering towards like higher LTV, right? That it's like, who are your best customers? Because you could track that 10 too. So you can look at this and say, okay, over the course of 6 months, 12 months, 24 months, it's like the people who responded this way end up becoming your best customers. With that knowledge, that information, you can do a better job of attracting those types of people. Where are those people hanging out? How can you make sure that you have ads that are doing a good job of attracting those types of responses and things like that? And because very often the lowest CAC is not your highest LTV. And we do see a lot of brands, it's very easy to optimize towards the lowest CAC, the highest ROAS, the highest MER. And, there's benefits to all of that. But if you're thinking long-term, you also want to say, but who's going to maybe be a little bit higher CAC, but drive 2 times the value over the next 24 months or whatever that might be.
And I've seen some things that are really surprising in the data, right? So like one brand we work with, they sell silicone rings, and they asked a question. They're asking competitive research questions. So they had one question that basically was like, which of these brands have you shopped before? And then if they've shopped these brands, there was a question that basically was like, why did you switch to us? And they had a bunch of options, and the last option was, I didn't switch, I'm still shopping from them as well. And so basically like what they found is that people who are buying from multiple brands for this product category were the best customers. So it's an interesting thing where it's like, okay, you're not you actually don't even have to take that customer away from your competitor. They're just like these people they just buy a lot of silicone rings, and they're just looking for the ones that they care about the most, the ones that are most interesting. They're not brand loyalists, but they spend a lot of money on this product category. And so that kind of data can be really, really interesting. And it differs so much from brand to brand. Again, like this is where we have a really hard time of, like, we do whatever we can. We want to dive in and help the brands that we work with to kind of unlock as much insight as possible. But at the end of the day, like if the brands that we're working with aren't actively seeking out how to solve these problems, it's hard for us to proactively help with that because we just don't know what the problems are, right? That's not always the case. Like obviously, like if we've worked in a specific category and we've done, like beauty products, for instance, like we have a ton of brands in beauty, and so we might have some ideas in that context of how to help you unlock more information. But at the end of the day, like there is like a partnership here that has to happen where the brand has to really want to seek these things out and ask us for guidance in order for us to be helpful.
Totally. And any brand, anytime you're working with any vendor, whether it's agency, software, anything, like reach out, because there's almost always something that you just don't know about how to optimize the software, what kind of questions to ask that you've learned over, millions and millions of survey questions, what other types of things that they could think about. And so that's always a good call out. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, like, this is just a little pet peeve of mine. And to be fair, or to be clear, I don't blame anybody for this because I do the same thing. But when you can't figure out how to do something with the software and you think it doesn't have capabilities, the worst thing for me is when I see somebody they'll cancel their subscription with us, and then they give a reason why, and it's something we do, and we have like not only do we know how to do it, but like we do it very well. And those kinds of things bother me so much. And again, to be clear, I do it too. Like I don't ask for help nearly as much as I should. So I'm not judging anybody for this. But to your point, Will, like ask for help, because like there is like the person on the service side of it, whether it's an agency or software provider or whatever, lives and breathes this thing, like is in it day in and day out for years probably. And so like there's just so much more information there that they have, if you're willing to take the time and engage with that.
Totally. Another thing that you called out that I really appreciated was along the lines of you're going to learn some of the objections that people had, right? So it's like if you send this out and you can learn 2-3 emails in, like, okay, well, why didn't you buy? What objections do you have? The thing that I love about this the most, so we run ads, that's what we do. The thing that I love about this the most is you turning that into an ad from now on and to add into my retargeting. And a lot of people look at retargeting, they say, well, what's the best ad for retargeting? Well, there isn't a best ad. I like to look at this and say, what are my top 3-5 objections, something along those lines. What's my best ad for each one of those objections? How do I make sure that I'm answering each one of those? Because why one person is objecting is not why somebody else is objecting. And so if you're just looking at the one that's getting the highest ROAS or whatever in platform, you're missing out on all the other people who were probably incremental because you didn't have an ad that was addressing their specific objection.
Yeah, I love that. I actually have never heard anybody talk about that specifically, but I like retargeting being about objection handling essentially. But I think that's a really, really good call out. And that's something it makes so much sense, right? Like the reason why you don't buy initially is, I mean, there's a few reasons, but the number one, if somebody's in market for a product, the reason you're not buying is because you have some sort of objection. Could be price, could be timing, could be the product itself, right? But like there's something there that's stopping you from purchasing at this moment.
Yeah. What are some other questions that maybe are a little bit less obvious that we should ask? Is it beneficial to use something like ChatGPT to come up with questions, or how can you come up with those questions that are really digging into the weeds?
Yeah. And this again is like where the challenge comes with the strategy side of things, right? Because I think the short answer to that is you don't know until you start to collect data. So like we all come into things, and we don't always use the more scientific terminology for this stuff, but essentially like we come in with a hypothesis, right? of what's happening. And so our questions, the initial questions we ask, are going to be based on whatever our belief is about how things are operating, right? Like we may come into things, and I'll use a specific example. One brand we work with, I think this is actually in a case study. Beekman 1802, they ran a survey question that they were giving. Sorry, let me back up a little bit. They had a really nice gift set, and this was a beautiful gift set that it was discounted because it had a bunch of different products in it, and was in this really nice packaging. And essentially, they were giving this really nice gift set wrapped and packaged together every time you purchased it. But they had a suspicion that not everybody was actually using this packaging. This packaging was very expensive. So they decided to ask a question of people who are buying that product and basically say, like, hey, you purchased this gift set. Are you actually going to gift it like this, or are you going to take it apart? And they found that most people were not actually gifting it. What they're doing is they're splitting it between somebody else and themselves, because they're getting a good discount on this item. And so they looked at that and said, okay, well, I guess if nobody's using this, why are we A, spending money on this, and B, like, basically this is just going to a landfill for no reason. So then they turned that into an add-on in the cart. So if you wanted to add the gift set in the cart, then you can do it from that standpoint, or in checkout, wherever that was. And so they turned this thing that was a cost to them into a revenue stream. But it was because they had a hypothesis that people weren't actually using this thing the way that they intended. And so I think, sorry, kind of going back to your question about like what makes a good question, I think it starts with having some sort of hypothesis. And oftentimes that starts with just asking some questions to gather information. And then as you see comments from people, as you see people, like I always like to do questions that have structured data. So like a multiple choice question, but with an other option where somebody can type in a response. Because what that gives you is it gives you the ability to track trends over time, and it allows people to kind of bucket themselves and self-select. But for that person that really wants to give you, and sorry, a point on that too, it means higher response rates, because you don't have to, people don't have to think about it. For that person that wants to take the time to give you more information, that data is really, really valuable. And so let them type whatever they want to in that other section. And that, to me, like analyzing those data points is where like the really valuable information starts to come from, and the trends start to come in. We have another case study coming up soon where somebody used a question about one of the questions in our like question library. We have a couple hundred questions you can just kind of browse through and look at. One of the questions was basically like, what TV shows do you watch? And they just let people type in what they wanted to. And they found a ton of people were watching Bridgerton. And so they took that data and they did a whole Bridgerton thing, and it absolutely crushed it. So just things like that, where it's like, you just got to ask questions, collect some data, and then like once you get some information, that gives you a hypothesis you can work from to be able to dive deeper.
I love that. And getting into psychographics to be able to use that to your advantage.
Absolutely.
You talked about attribution being one of the big things, right? Like if people are starting, a lot of times they'll start with the attribution questions because you're spending $100 million a year. And so that matters to you. And it is a good data point. And I'll call out right now while we're talking about this. One of the biggest reasons why we as an ad agency love that Heidi How, right? How did you hear about us question is because it's another data point. If you're looking at in-platform attribution, things that are top of funnel, YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, they're significantly going to underreport how incremental that was towards just driving that awareness in the first place. Because there's a lot of, more based on last click a lot of times. Even if you're using good attribution tools and you've modeled out data, it still misses a lot of that when you actually compare what that tool says to what your actual customers say. And so it's a really good question. But here's where it gets sometimes a little bit tricky, and I want to know what you think about this and how you solve this. Somebody says they keep it as just a very simple single question, and somebody says, I heard about you from Meta. Okay, great. Meta as an influencer, Meta from an ad, Meta from organic. Like, how do you begin to break down, the different things that they have going on. And they could have several really big influencers in there. There is a company we work with where, they're working with some of the biggest personalities you could possibly imagine. It helps to even know which personality did you hear it from as well. But how are you guys approaching that?
Yeah. So going back to like the ask more questions thing, I think the short answer is that's the solution to this. So in the context of attribution, so we like the standard, if you go into our platform right now, we have pre-built survey templates. And so if you just click on kind of the basic attribution template, it's going to have a handful of questions. So how did you first hear about us is the question we recommend asking first. And the reason we insert the term first is because we want to know what the customer remembers as their first touch point. And I'll be clear with this. Like, I don't look at any form of data, and I'm going to say like attribution surveys as well, as being the absolute truth of what happened in this context, right? Like the reality is every form of data is biased. So your Google Analytics is very biased towards the last click, right? And it's literally looking at session level data. So it has no context for what happened a month ago,
right?
In your TikTok account, right? So like that's a very biased data set. Your TikTok ads manager in this context, your Meta ads manager is going to be very biased towards what they can see. They also only see a picture of this. And the bias in survey data is somebody's memory, right?
Sure.
Or like, so like my memory is not perfect. I'm sure yours isn't either. But I think what's really interesting with that data point, when you ask somebody, how did you first hear about us? They're going to tell you what they remember as the source. And so it may not be true, but it does tell you what source was impactful for them, right? Like which channel actually, even if they're wrong, because this is another thing I see sometimes. Somebody will like, well, I added billboard and 2% of people said that they saw me on a billboard, which is actually, I've never actually seen it that high. I've seen a handful of people select billboard. I'm like, okay, well, if somebody said billboard, there's something about that they think you're in a billboard. So it still tells you a little bit about their behavior, even if it doesn't tell you anything about your behavior. And so like understanding billboard's not a great example of that, but like, TikTok is a good example. If you get a bunch of people saying that they found you on TikTok, but actually it was a Instagram post that had the TikTok watermark on it, that still tells you that they're spending time on TikTok, or they wouldn't have said TikTok, right?
Right.
So there's some things like that where I think that's really impactful. So anyway, kind of stepping out from the weeds on this a little bit, I like asking that, how did you first hear about this question? Because it's going to get at like that memory touch point. And oftentimes that touch point will go back months or years. And then I like to ask them follow-up questions to that. So if they said that they found you, and this kind of gets specifically at what you're talking about, if they say that they found you on Facebook, well, then let's ask questions like, who posted about us? Or where on Facebook did you see it, right? And so you can start to dive in a little bit. I like the who posted about us, because basically what that gets to is the options I like to make sure are included in there is somebody I follow. So that's kind of influencer, right? A friend or family member. That's more of like the word of mouth. Essentially, like that's how I bucket these, right? So someone I follow is an influencer on Facebook. And you can even ask then a specific follow-up question to that and say, who was it? And let them tell you. Friend or family member. Well, that's essentially just word of mouth, but it happened on social media, right? You did, or your brand did, right? Well, then that's probably a paid ad, because very few brands actually have a strong organic presence. Usually if somebody's seeing your brand's post, it's a paid advertisement. And then throw an ad as an option, right? Because then some people may be like, oh yeah, it was an ad that I saw. So I think those are the types of things that I like to look at. And that kind of helps you, like I like to start platform level and then dive specific from there. And then you can kind of break those out into saying, well, that's actually influencer, that's word of mouth, that's paid ads. And that helps break through that noise a little bit. So there's that. And then the other questions I like to ask too are either what brought you to our site today? So that's focused on kind of like last touch, or where else have you seen us? I don't think you need both of those, but one of those questions can be really valuable. So if somebody says that they they discovered you on Facebook, but they've also seen you on TV, that's a really good data point to have, because then then my last question, which is one of the other questions I think is critical, is how long did you know about us before placing your first purchase? And
That's
what you're going
good.
to see is that people who find you on Google say that they buy much faster than people who found you on Facebook, or people who found you on Facebook but also saw you on TV might buy faster than people who just saw you on Facebook and didn't see you on TV as well. So understanding that just gives you like a really rich way of understanding the relationship between the channels, and also like the time to conversion. Because the way that you should be thinking about this, in my opinion, is that if somebody says they found you on Google and they also say they bought in 24 hours, well, you need your ROI on Google to like,
Yes.
you need that to happen in 24 hours or 7 days or whatever your window is. It should happen very quickly. But if somebody says they found you on TikTok 6 months ago, that tells you something about like the buying journey of your customers who are discovering you on TikTok. And maybe you don't need to see all of that return on the ad spend happen in the first 7 days if you're confident that a large percentage of the impact is happening in 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. Obviously, you have to take into consideration your cash flow, but that's the way that I like to think about that.
I love that. And it reminds me too of mean, median, and mode. And so where I go at with this when we're talking to people a lot of times too is you might have some people that are saying 2 years, 6 months, whatever that might be.
Yep.
That's fine. And if you take the average of that, you may end up with a number that's still not accurate. Now I should at least get closer to what's accurate, but I do like to look at mode for things like this as well. Because I think that you'll start to see that that's more of the pattern. So maybe the average is 5, but the mode is 3. Okay.
Yep.
Then when I start to launch changes within an ad account, I'm expecting it within 3 days to really start to notice that there's a difference versus waiting a whole 5 days for something like that.
Yep.
The other thing to your point that I really like that you called out is, if you're running this on something that is a little bit more considered, and maybe the average time to purchase, well, first of all, whatever you see in GA4 is not the actual average time to purchase, because again, bias data. And I see people reference that all the time. They're like, look, your average time to purchase is 3 days. Well, not when you compare that to what people said, right? When you compare that to what they said, it's actually a lot longer than it might be 7 days, 14 days. It's usually significantly longer than whatever GA4 says. Because again, bias, it's based on session data. But once you've figured out what that is, and you know that it's like, okay, I expect to see this turnaround in 7 days, or whatever that might be, you got to look at least whatever are those leading metrics. And so you've made some changes within your ad account or to your email or to whatever's going on. Are you seeing at least the reach is the same, the traffic is the same, are you seeing an uptick in carts or things that are leading you towards, yes, this is likely the right scenario, but it's only been 2 days. You need to give this 3 more days or whatever that might be before you can make a decision on whether or not something's working. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think I love this for launching new channels as well. So like a lot of times we're working with a brand that does, I just actually was talking to a brand that's running ads on App11, which is kind of people are talking about.
It's gaining a lot of popularity right now.
It is, yeah. So somebody was talking about that just the other day. And so what we looked at is said, okay, cool. Like you add there, because there's a question of accuracy in survey data, right?
Sure.
And I think it's way overblown that the questioning of the accuracy of the data. But I also understand why people have this question. So I think this is a really great point here. So this one brand I'm talking to, they went from 0 to like 15-20% of their customers saying that they found them on a mobile app game in like 2 weeks. Like it's actually, and at scale, like this is pretty impressive. So I'm like, okay, well that's suspicious. But then we filter the data to say, okay, because I when I see stuff like that, I immediately question it as well, right? And so then we filter the data and we say, okay, well, we're gonna filter the how long did you know about us question by people who said they found you from a mobile game and a game ad, or I forget what the phrasing is exactly. So we filter it down to just those people, and we see that 70% of them say that they discovered them less than a week ago. Well, that makes sense, right? Sure. And compared to the average being far longer than that. And something like, it basically is flipped, like 70-30 flipped between less than a week and greater than a week. So that kind of thing is like that's why I like to look at these, like even in the context of a survey, look at multiple data points. And then that gives me a lot of confidence in that channel too, because I say, okay, well, I'm looking at this, you're already seeing this massive growth. And we know that if you filter those people out, typically it's going to take somebody 1 to 3 months to make their first purchase. Like that's what we normally see. So I actually look at this and say, well, likely this channel is going to be even more impactful a month or 3 months from now than what it's showing up as today. So anyway, those are the kinds of things that I like to dive into. And that's why I think it's worth asking those extra questions. The other thing I will say too is if you're asking kind of that set of questions, we see an average of about an 85% completion rate on that. So again, like it's 100% for every question they answer. But in that set, we typically see if somebody answers the first question and you have those 4 or 5 attribution oriented questions, 85% of those people will answer all of those. So
nice. I'm glad that you called out just this whole idea of people disregarding sometimes customer survey data a little bit. There's a consultant that came into an account that we're working with right now for Q4. And they came from a very, very big, multi-billion-dollar company. And they're like, yeah, I don't buy any of it. Like literally just completely disregard it. They're looking at last click. And, for those of us who have been around, we're like, I think that's to your detriment. That's fine. But I'm glad you called this up because there are some people who maybe will disregard that. I think the reason why they disregard it is based on what you called out. That might not be actually referencing where they truly first discovered you.
Yes.
But it's where they remember first discovering it. And to your point, that is very, very valuable information because that's when it actually was impactful. That's when it stuck in their brain. And I think that can't be disregarded so easily.
Yep.
In fact, we found Grace Peach on my team did a study with some customer survey data where we found based on the UTM data compared with the customer survey data that we saw for this particular customer, over something like 35,000 orders, the attribution was off by about 81%. It was massive. We intuitively knew this. But once we could finally show this customer that, it opened up a whole new world for them because they had been, I don't even remember the exact numbers, significantly underinvesting in Meta and TikTok and overinvesting in Google. And there's a lot to be had on Google, but they were weighting it very, very wrong. Because of this, we were able to show them, scale them up massively as a result.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the attribution problem is really interesting because basically if you're looking at click data, it's going to be biased towards the last session that somebody had, essentially, right? Like even if you're looking at like using something like a triple whale or like MTA sort of data or the ad platform data or obviously Google Analytics is the most biased of them. But I think like and it's because like at the end of the day, like there is no reliable way to track data over an extended period of time in a browser. People use different browsers. I'm using a different browser right now to record this than I normally do because for some reason I can't use Riverside in my normal browser, right? And that doesn't mean like maybe I'll go look up some other things on here right now, right? I've got my phone. I've got my wife sends me things by text message. I look at it on my phone and then I hate buying things on my phone, so I'm going to do it on my computer, right? Like that whole process is so convoluted and there is actually no reliable way to connect all those data points together. And so I think like the click and cookie side of things is extremely challenging. And not to say it's useless, right? Like I think what it does do a really good job of is showing you like which ad drove a purchase. It's actually extremely good at that. But that doesn't mean that that's the ad that actually got you interested in the product or stuck out to you the first time.
Right.
And so that's kind of like the one side of things. And then you've got this, you've got other solutions like an MMM or something like a house where you're doing incrementality measurement and all of those kinds of things. And those are actually, I think those are great solutions. But there's a couple of challenges there. One, they're very expensive. And two, you're actually only, and MTA kind of has the same problem too. You're only tracking something if you know to track it, if that makes sense. And I think one of the beautiful things about a survey, like this brand I was just telling you about that's running on App 11, they had people telling them they were finding them from a game ad before they added that as an option to their survey. And so I think like that's another really important point here is that the survey is the only thing outside of like a Google Analytics, I guess, can kind of do this too if you want to trust like a last click source. It's one of the only ways for people to actually tell you that they are discovering you in a place without you having to know already that somebody is going to be coming from that place. And the reality in running a business online is that you don't know which random influencer with 1 million followers bought your product and is now talking about it on their YouTube channel. And you don't know like which person posted about you on Reddit and now that drove 1,000 purchases and all that's coming through as a Google search, right? Like you just don't see these kinds of things. 1,000's kind of excessive, but anyway, you get my point.
Sure.
That kind of stuff happens a lot, right? Word of mouth, like that's another one. In aggregate, 15 to 20% of purchases are driven by word of mouth. Retail store sales is another big one, right? Like all of these kinds of things, you are not tracking those things with any of these other methodologies, except for in the context of a survey. That's all tracked automatically, whether you're including that in your question or not. So anyway, that's, I think, another like really important point about an attribution survey.
And to your point, whether you're asking that as a question or not, I think to your point, it's because of open-ended questions. And so I did want to dig into that a little bit. You had mentioned like the idea of like fill in, you know, how far do you go with the ability for people to just really go open-ended versus just fill in?
Yeah. Okay. So this is another really good point too, actually. So it depends on what your objectives and goals are. So if you are a true classic, a Hexclad, a Ridge, like some of these bigger brands that we work with, where you're, 9-figure brand and Jones Road Beauty, those kinds of brands, the trend tracking is really important. So I'm not just looking for it's actually useless to me to get 10,000 people typing in a response. It's far more useful to get 20,000 people selecting an option where I can easily track that trend over time and see like how things are shifting on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. So it depends on the scale that your business is at, and to a large extent, I think, and then it depends on the type of data you're trying to collect. I look at it and say, okay, for open-ended questions, one single response can be extremely useful because it can give you a lot of detail. Like I've seen this before. One person writes in and says, I had this specific issue on your website. You go, you check, and something's broken on your website. That's extremely valuable.
Sure.
That's more valuable than getting 100 people saying that you've got a 4 on usability for your website, right? Because like you don't know what that means. So I think scale matters, and then the type of data you're tracking. So to kind of like get specific with this, if you are a brand who's just starting out, and let's say you have 100 orders a month, asking how did you first hear about his question, maybe that's valuable. If you're scaling ads and you want to know what kind of impact you're having. But the reality is, if you're spending all your dollars in Meta at that point, it doesn't really matter. You just need to see, like, are you getting more dollars out than you're putting in? Right. And maybe you ask that question for a couple of weeks just to kind of validate, like, hey, people are finding me through this. But that question isn't going to move the needle a whole lot for your business. Mm-hmm. What's going to be more impactful is literally just asking somebody, hey, why'd you decide to buy from us today? Open-ended question, let them type whatever they want to in there, and they're going to give you whatever they feel like telling you, right? And that's going to give you ad inspiration. It's going to help you understand like what about your messaging resonated or didn't resonate. It's going to help you understand what kind of hesitations people had in the purchase process, all those kinds of things. And maybe you get 10 responses a month, but that data is going to be far more valuable than asking how did you first hear about this question. So that's the way I
like that question. And I like the opposite of it. Was there anything that like almost prevented you from from purchasing today, right? Yeah. Like both of those are really good open-ended questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that we actually, this is in one of the templates we offer as well. Like I think we have a conversion rate optimization template. And there's actually a question of how was your purchase experience today? So it's like, very, very good / great down to very poor. And then depending on what somebody selects, you then ask them either, if it was a good experience, you say, hey, thanks so much for letting us know, like, why'd you decide to buy today? And just like be super positive about it. And if they had a poor experience, you're taking that into consideration. You're saying, okay, what did we do wrong? What could we have done better? What was it that almost made you not purchase today? Those kinds of questions, right? So you can actually be pretty smart too with with that. And that's actually one of my tips for open-ended questions too, is make it further down the logic chain. Don't lead with an open-ended question. I mean, again, if you have 10 orders a month, sure, lead with it, because like you're not going to get that much data. So just go for it. But if you have 10,000 orders a month, don't like bury those in the logic chain, and make sure you're actually like getting responses to help solve a specific problem or potential problem. That's a little bit more in depth than just tracking trends on something.
I like that. Something else that you tweeted about that I really liked, and I hadn't considered before seeing you say this, is questions that drive to actions. And so the example that you had was, making your last question, would you like to connect with us in any of the following ways? And you listed refer a friend, join our VIP group, follow us on social. It's a brilliant way to get the question and actually get them to take action right then and there. Like, tell me a little bit more about like how you're facilitating this and why this even like was a tweet that you sent out.
Yeah. So obviously, like through this chat, I'm trying not to be like salesy with our product.
Sure.
But at the end of the day, I think for this solution, we're the only ones that do this and have like this kind of capability. So this is going to be a no specific thing. What we have in our platform is what we call actions, and they are essentially, I mean, you've described this, but it's basically, we want to get somebody to take a specific action. And the best way to do that, there's kind of two ways that brands do it. One is they just slap it on the end of a survey as like the confirmation screen. And that definitely works. So like, hey, thanks so much for taking our survey. Like one sort of way to go about this is like an appeal to the customer, right? Thanks for taking our survey. We rely heavily on people like you telling people they love about our product. Would you like to join our Refer a Friend program? And that's just like, everybody sees that. Something like that probably gets pretty good click rates, but it's not the highest possible. You're just showing it to everybody. The other approach is to make it super focused and say, hey, we'd love to connect with you more. Would you like to connect with us in any of these following ways? Follow us on social, refer a friend, join our VIP group, download our app. All of those kinds of things are extremely easy to do. And you're giving the customer control over their experience. And so we see very positive results from that. And so if you give somebody the ability to select what they want, and we usually recommend doing it in a multiple choice question, and then you use conditional logic to show that thing that they've selected. So if they say, I want to download your app, I want to join your VIP group, and I want to follow you on social, you show them all three of those things. So you basically just like, they're cards that they can click through. And so when they, you've got the app download buttons right there. They can click on the app download button, download the app. You've got the refer a friend button right there. They can click that, go to the refer a friend page, sign up. And then you've got your social follow buttons as well. And they can do all that in that context. And what we see is on average, and this is for both types, so basically just like slapping it on the end of the survey, and as well as like using logic to push somebody through, we see a 15% click-through rate on these. And that's the average. But we see like for app downloads, it's like a 25% click-through rate. So these are really effective ways to actually get somebody to take action. And those have downstream massive implications on the longevity of the relationship with the customer, especially when you're talking about, most of the time this is showing up in a new customer survey, right? So this is one of their first interactions with your brand post-purchase, at least. And actually, it is the first interaction post-purchase for most of these people. And so being able to push them deeper into a relationship with your brand, getting them to download your app, all that kind of stuff is going to have massive impacts on LTV. So yeah, it's something that we have not pushed enough. We're trying to push it more. But like last year in Q4, we showed 1.7. It was like right at 1.75 million actions. So I'm hoping this year it's more like 3 to 4 million. That's part of my push right now, is to try to get more brands doing this, because it does have an impact. And we see, we have a case study with Talkable, three big brands that we work with, drove anywhere from a 30 to 400% increase in refer a friend activity by doing this. So like that's one example. We've seen other things. We had somebody who used this with Social Snowball. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they doubled their Social Snowball referral rate from their order confirmation screen. And anyway, there's a bunch of examples like this, but Tapcar app downloads, we've seen a bunch of brands double their app download rate. And it's just because you're capturing somebody's attention at the right time. You're using intent. They've already like opted into taking the surveys, answering these questions, and they say, yes, I want this thing. And then you give them that thing, they're going to take action on it.
And I think that's the thing that I like about this is because, there is that yes ladder, right? Where it's like, you've already gotten them to say yes to this. They've said yes to answering this question. They've said yes. You've basically primed them to saying yes to everything you're asking them to do. And so if you ask them right then and there, they're already in the mind to say like, well, yes, I do as well.
That reminds me, actually, this is years ago, but there was one of these internet gurus had this whole thing about like, get somebody to say yes once, right? Like say yes to a small ask, and then everything else up to you just keep, the yes letter is the term you use. I don't know if it's the same term, but basically like that small yes gets them to do more and more things until eventually they do the thing you want them to do. And in that context, it was, buy a $500 course or whatever the item was that was being sold. But yeah, that process of just getting somebody to say yes once makes that whole thing much easier.
Mm-hmm. You are running these for brands that are at the absolute forefront of D2C right now. And you've seen millions of questions and responses, and you've analyzed a lot of this data. What are some other things that you have learned from looking at the data that might surprise people?
Yeah. So a couple of things I think that I think are oftentimes surprising. So when there's kind of a desire when you're running ads to be able to assign a value of every purchase to ads, at least as much as possible, right? And also kind of paired with that, there's this idea of direct traffic or organic traffic. And I think what's interesting about the data that we look at is like direct traffic doesn't exist. Organic traffic doesn't. Organic depends on how you define it. But like at the end of the day, every single order has a discovery source. People don't just type in your domain name and buy something. Like that just doesn't happen, right? And so like that's like the one side of the spectrum is that versus like, the other side of the spectrum is like trying to assign ad credit to everything. And the reality is that there's kind of this middle road where a lot of orders are being powered by word of mouth, being powered by discovery and offline sources. And so I think to me, like the impact of offline, I guess is what I'm getting at here, is so massive. And I think that's really undervalued by a lot of brands that are spending money on paid ads and that are selling products online. But the reality is for all of us, like so much of what we do in life happens outside of the internet. And so I think that's one thing that's been a little bit surprising, I would say, just like in terms of like we all know that that's there, but like the size of that impact, I think, is surprising. And then the other thing that's really interesting too, that immediately comes to mind is like who people are buying for. I think is a really interesting data point. Like I think ultimately I would expect that more gifting is happening than is happening. The majority of purchases are bought by people for themselves. Even in the holiday season, half of people are buying for themselves. And so I think that's a really interesting finding, and that's an aggregate. Every brand is a little bit different, right? But so that's like the one thing that I think is surprising just in general. But then within that, there's some interesting stuff where it's like, okay, if you are, I'll use True Classic again. Keep coming back to these guys, but obviously, like
they're a good one.
They're a good one. Yeah, they're kind of a male focused brand, right? And so like I don't know exactly what their data looks like, but like if I'm them, I'm assuming there's a lot of gifting happening around Father's Day. That's a moment in the year where there's probably a lot of gift buying, and so and I'm saying that's just because we see these kinds of things with certain brands. So a brand asks the question of who is this purchase for, and you find out that there's certain moments in the year where people are buying for a significant other, or people are buying for a family member or a coworker or whatever those things are. And so for individual brands, there is massive impact around certain moments of the year, even though most people in general and in aggregate are still buying for themselves online. So I think like those two things are true at the same time. The other thing I will say too is the amount of money that people spend by who they're purchasing for is an interesting thing. So significant other people, this is not on a per brand basis, if that makes sense. So like this is not necessarily saying that like if somebody buys from True Classic for themselves versus for a significant other, that this is going to be different. But just looking at the aggregate of all sales, people who are buying for a significant other are buying more expensive things. And so like that's a really interesting data point too. So if I'm looking at this and I say, okay, well, I've got a, I don't know, I'm HexCloud, I've got a high AOV product. Maybe I should be talking to people about buying for their significant other, because that's a really people are willing to spend money on their significant other, which makes sense, right? Like I do that. I'm going to spend more money on my wife than I am my kids. That's just how it goes. So
yeah.
So things that like they're not that much of a surprise, but like they are, to actually see the data and see how that plays out, I think is really powerful.
It is interesting, and because it's just good to have the data to back that up, because you might have a gut, suspicion, but having data back that up is interesting.
Yeah.
I like that you called out word of mouth and like just the power of offline. I do think that's something that we miss a lot. And so one of the things I like to talk about, at least from an advertising perspective, is after somebody's purchased from you, don't let the very next ad they see from you be another ad to buy.
Yeah.
If you want to increase word of mouth, the next thing that they see ad wise from you should be romancing your customer. I talk about dating them. The idea it's like, you want to show them something that makes them say, wow, I clearly just made the best choice possible by buying this thing. Like I am a hero, because that's what's going to make them want to share that. And again, the attribution you're going to see in platform to this is basically nothing. You're not going to see any attribution to this. You just have to know intuitively that you are now ingratiating your customer even more to you and to the decision that they made. And because of that, they're more excited to talk about, oh, I just got this thing and I'm excited about it, versus I just got this thing and I'm not sure about it yet.
Yes, absolutely. That's so smart. And I think what you just said too about you're not going to see a direct impact of that. Like that, I think that's a really important piece of this too. Like there's so much in the world of selling a product online, digital marketing, all of that, where we want to be able to assign value to everything. But that's just not the way the world works in reality. And so I think that's a good thing for people to keep in mind too. It's just like there's sometimes you just have to do something because you know it's the right thing to do, or because you believe that that's going to have some sort of impact. And I think that the challenge there, and this is actually something I'm curious about how you manage this, is how much do I actually spend on that when there is no like I don't even know how you actually tie that back to like an LTV, right? Like it's extraordinarily hard to do that because it's not like it's driving to any direct action. But yeah, I am curious like how you think about that in that context.
There are ways to tie this back to LTV to a point, but it gets very complicated to your point. So I'll walk through like a basic way of starting to get some enough data to where you can maybe model this out.
Okay.
Let's say that you are collecting UTM data on all of these different things. And while we know that that's not perfect, it's unfortunately gotten a lot worse. You ideally have some segment of data that's going to suggest which ad they came from.
Yeah.
If you're also collecting the good survey responses, not just on the first time somebody bought from you, but like you said, on repeat buyers as well, like what are different things that's going on with them as well. You can begin to associate to some extent a small fraction of people as having some kind of interaction with this. Now it's so small, but you can look at this and say, okay, is there enough here that I can at least extrapolate something to validate what's going on? And then you can look at those people who have at least submitted that data and see what is the LTV of those people versus the LTV of the people who didn't come through those UTMs, didn't say those things in the response questions. And again, this ends up getting into the thing where it's like, this is not statistically significant, but you've got a gut hunch because this is how human brains work. You've got some data to back it up. And if you've got a smart CEO, smart CFO, ideally they'll look at that and say, yeah, that makes sense. Now, how do you set how much that you put towards this? It doesn't actually have to be a lot. And the biggest reason why is because I like to run these as reach campaigns. My goal is not a conversions. I don't need to set this up as a $50 CPM. I can set this up on a $2 CPM reach campaign. I just want to make sure that they see whatever this is
Yep.
And for a lot of brands, that's, a couple $100, couple $1,000 a month, whatever it is, it's less than 1% of your advertising budget on that channel.
Yep. Just a tiny bit to nurture those people.
Right.
Yeah. Super smart.
I want to start getting into the next section of the talk here, which is, who is Jeremiah Prummer?
Yeah.
And one of the questions I want to start with is, why did you start KnoCommerce in the first place? What was going on that you were like, this is the thing I want to build?
Yeah. So I talked about this a little bit in some other context too. So if I'm repeating anything, well, some of that's intentional, but hopefully it's not too repetitive. So I have a friend who owns an agency. Pearson Crass is his name. Lunar Solar Group is the agency. And he started the agency in 2018. I helped him out for a little bit. And then I was like, agency work is not for me. I was doing website builds. It was rough. And our goal had always been to build a tech company. And we first got to know each other when I was building WooCommerce extensions, like 2013. He owned a brand at the time, and then I went from that to my own brand. And so we've been in the e-commerce space for each of us for 7 to 10 years basically, in 2018. And so we were like, hey, we're going to build a tech company, and kind of the agency life just took over. And so I was like, okay, I can't do this. I'm gonna go work in tech. And then in 2020, he was like, okay, man, like I'm ready. Let's do this thing. So I came back to the agency, and we basically we started this from like, hey, we want to build something. What are the problems that we have? Like, what are the things that we've both experienced over, 10 plus years each in selling products online? And we kept coming back to this idea of like, we don't know who is buying and why they're buying. And that's the most simple version of this. And obviously you can see how this balloons into so many other things. Sure. But like, there's a lot of really great tools out there to tell you which product somebody buys first. If somebody buys product A, how likely are they to buy product B in the future? Like all that kind of stuff, right? And all of that's kind of based on behavioral data, like trackable, easy to track behavioral data in the shopping experience. And so there's some good tools for that, but there's not really anything. And I would say even like we haven't gotten there in terms of like the long-term vision of how I see this playing out. There's not very much good information to help you understand like who actually is your customer and what motivates them to buy your products. And so a piece of that obviously is attribution, like where they're discovering you and going beyond the click data and kind of like that, again, like the easy to track behavioral data versus the actual like behind the scenes thing that's happening. So the attribution piece is part of that. Demographics, I think, is part of that as well. The other thing that we've been doing for a while now in a beta, and ultimately we'll do more with this, is what we call our automated insight survey. And so we're asking questions around like where you spend time online, what motivates you to buy products online, economic sentiment, some demographic data, that kind of stuff. And then we're basically grouping that together and letting brands compare their experience to that. So that was, anyway, and then there's going to be more coming. So all of that to say, like, that was the original vision. It was like, hey, how can we build something that's going to solve this problem? And we're still very much building. We're very much in the early stages as far as I'm concerned. Lots more to come with that. And I still don't think anybody's solved this. And maybe it's not solvable. There's also that element. Like at the end of the day, as consumers, do we even want that to be solved? I don't know. There's something nice about I like to buy online in part because I don't have to walk into a store and talk to somebody and have them know everything about me and all of that. So, yeah. Yeah.
And that's fair. I'd say most things are solvable problems though, right? Like it's very rare that I would say something's not a solvable problem.
Yeah.
You knew that you wanted to be an entrepreneur, likely though from a young age, because your parents were entrepreneurs.
Yes. Yeah. So my parents, I grew up as the child of entrepreneurs, and when I was 6, so I'm the oldest of 4. That we had a 6-year-old in our house, basically 6, 4, 2, and a baby. And my parents,
busy.
So busy. I don't know how my parents did this, but they And my dad was a propane serviceman at that time. So he literally drove like a propane truck around and like delivered propane to people's houses. And he'd previously worked at a gas station and for UPS. Like he was not, my parents did not have money. And they'd gotten into this like low income house buying program. And so that happened when I was probably like 4. And so over a couple of years, they basically got to where they had $25,000 in equity. And so they took the $25,000 in equity out of their house and opened a health food store. And so that was like literally like putting it all on the line with 4 little children to start a business. So like it has to work, right? Like there's no backup plan. They literally like they had nothing. They sold, like my mom, we'd been in a car accident and my mom got some insurance money for like her bodily injury. And that was like part of the money they used to start the business, right? So it was like everything went into this. It was an all or nothing sort of play. And I was 6 and I just kind of like grew up with that. Like, I mean, my earliest memories I have a few memories from before that, but a lot of it was just like that business. And so we basically lived there. Like after school every day we were there. Obviously my parents were like, hey, help us with these things. My first version of an allowance was doing work for them. And it was just like, hey, they had a mailer that they sent out, some, old school marketing. Sign up for our mailing list and we'll send you a mailer every month. And so like that was how I got paid. I think it was like $23 a month to do this.
Nice.
And it was like folding paper and stamping it and putting labels on it and all that kind of stuff. And so I grew up in that, and I think like I really just liked like the excitement and energy and all the things that come with running a business, and like everything's different every day. And I also like got to see like the behind the scenes of running a business. And as a arrogant child, I thought I could do it better than my parents always. And I had all these ideas and like, I want to do this. Like, I want to be in charge. I want to do this. Like this is, I don't know. So it was kind of weird. Like, I think I kind of, I thought higher of it than I should have in terms of like, I don't know, glorifying it to an extent. I don't know how to describe that, but like, I had this idea of like, this is like this really awesome thing, but I also kind of got to see like the nitty gritty of it and some of the downsides of it. And of course, again, I thought I could do it better. So I always wanted to do it on my own. And so that was, I started my first business as a 19-year-old in college. And I've been an entrepreneur since then. So I think I've had 5 different businesses at this point. Some of them short, some of them a little bit longer. But yeah.
It sounds like you came into it though with like a full understanding of it because you saw it. So like you said, you saw the ups, you saw the downs, which is kind of good.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I think it's interesting because now, like, I'm in my 30s. I'm married. I've got kids. Some of the things my parents, like the sacrifices my parents made, are not ones that I feel like I'm willing to make at this point in my life. So there's some interesting things with that too, where it's like, okay, I saw that. I think I thought I wanted some of these things. And then you actually get into like building the vision of what you want for your family. And you realize that, okay, well, this is actually different now. So I do think like, yes, I fully understood, but I also didn't really understand the implications of what some of those things would mean, if that makes sense. So
it does. And that's fair.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a couple of quotes that you mentioned to me before that you really like to live by. One of them was under promise and over deliver. And I think we get that one, but like, why is that one something that just really resonates with you?
Yeah. I think and to be clear, like, I don't think I always, if I was to say like there's a scale of like living up to this every single time,
sure.
Like I don't, but I try to, because I think like what the last thing that I ever want is to tell somebody like I'm going to like, I don't want to sell a big vision that can't actually be delivered. And I think like in the startup world, in the software world in particular, there's a lot of that happens, right? There's a lot of really big promises like, hey, in the agency world, there's this too, right? Like, hey, sign up for our service and we're going to triple your revenue sort of thing. And it's like, okay,
Sure.
well, maybe like I'm sure that's happened, but like, are you actually going to be able to deliver on that every single time? So I think, again, like I don't live up to this perfectly. And where I struggle with that, I think is like, I have things I know that I can do for somebody and want to do for that person. I just end up not having the ability to do that for some reason, the resources, things like that. That's where I kind of fall out. But I never promise something I don't feel confident can be delivered, if that makes sense. And yeah, so I think that's what it is. And the struggle there, there's this, I think we and I talked about this a little bit. We work with the brands, and we got their rating. They had like a whole tech stack rating. And I won't get too much into it, but essentially like they said like, hey, this was a 5-star thing and it's now a 3-star thing. Still good, but not as good as we want it to be. It's not making the progress we want. And I think like that's an example of where the under promise and over deliver can hurt sometimes. But I think I still like am very much deep into this thing where it's like, okay, we made promises and now we're finding that we're having a hard time. There's a lot of things we need to change to be able to make sure that we're always delivering on that promise. There's foundational things that need to change in our business. There's all of this stuff that all this work that has to go on behind the scenes because we promise this thing and we're not 100% delivering every single time. And so we're going to then take all of our time and attention and focus and make sure that we're delivering on that 100% of the time. And to be clear, like we delivered 98% of the time on these things, right? It's not like it's like a massive miss, but there were moments where it's like, okay, there's a bug in something that we should address. Or like, hey, we could make this performance better on this thing. Or if we modify this piece of technology, it's going to operate better, it's going to be faster, more efficient, and it's going to save us money, which saves our customers money. So all of these kinds of things, I think like that under promise, over deliver really, I think, plays out in like the way that we approach everything and try to be very excellent at every single piece of responsibility in our business.
Like you said, we're not going to hit it 100% of the time, but it's a very good aspirational thing to go into with everything that you do in life.
Yeah.
You've told me a couple of funny stories here. I'm going to let you pick which one you tell. There was either the poop castle or the buffalo carcass, whichever one you feel more excited to chat through.
All right, cool. Yeah. So we were talking about, stories. I'll set the stage with this one. So in college, again, I come from like a modest background, and so I didn't have money to pay for college. And so one of the things I did in college was I worked as a dorm janitor, and I got free room and board, so place to stay and food to eat for free, in exchange for cleaning the dorms every Saturday and Sunday, and then being on call one night a week to clean up any messes that were too gross, too big, whatever, to wait until the next morning. And so this one night, this is lots of stuff happened. This is like a little bit more of a funny experience. There were a lot of far worse experiences, but I get a call from the resident director at a dorm. He's like, "Hey, Jeremiah, so I'm sorry to do this, but we need you to come down and clean up a poop castle." And I was like, okay, no idea what a poop castle is. But I actually was like, it's interesting, right? Like I was a little bit excited about like, what is this thing? And so I called him. I called my friend who was a janitor in that dorm. Because he lived in that dorm. I was on call that night. And I was like, hey, you should come check this out. And so I walked into this dorm. It's an all boys dorm. And it's, I don't know, 500 teenage boys live here basically. And so I walk in, and there's all at the front desk, there's all the resident assistants sitting there, and they're all kind of giggling and stuff. And so they take me down into the basement. There's like a basement in this building, which I actually lived at this building for my freshman year for a little bit. And so they call it the pit, and there's 10 rooms down there. It's like a very small group. And so they take me down there, walk me into the bathroom, and sitting on the floor in front of a toilet, so it's in the stall in front of the toilet, is a poop castle. and it's literally somebody had pooped in a circle, so it was like a spiral. It looked like the
Oh,
poop emoji,
yeah,
pre-emojis though. Like I don't, maybe this is where the poop emoji came
sure.
from. And they pooped on the floor, and they had planted a flag in it that said "poop castle." So they literally, like, this is premeditated. So they literally made a flag with like a stick and like a little piece of paper that said "poop castle" on
It's
it. And
such a college dorm thing.
such a yeah. So anyway, so that was one of those, like, it was a great story. We had one of my friends at one point, she made like poop castle cupcakes for my birthday, and just like things like that were just like there's some fun things from that. So anyway, there are lots of gross things. I mean, that is gross still, but like
Sure.
it could have been far worse, and it's a good story that I get to remember now. So
I love it. I'm glad you shared that with us.
yeah.
This is an interesting time for us to talk about this next question because for those who are watching this, this will post maybe a month later, but we just saw the election results here this morning. So this is November 6th that we're recording this. One of the things that you and I had talked about before is a passion of yours is how do we use business innovation to solve problems versus the government? And there's pros and cons to both, and there are problems that can be solved with both, but you're passionate about like the business side of how we use business to solve problems. Take me through like what and why.
Yeah, okay, so I live in a city. I'm an urban dweller, suburban, I guess, really. I have a multiracial family. I'm like, I would say like a lot of the people where I come from would describe me as liberal at this point in my life. But I wouldn't necessarily. So it's kind of an interesting, like I've got this background. I grew up in like a very rural, very conservative, like we don't trust the government sort of place. So like just to set the groundwork, like that definitely frames a little bit of like my background. And then now I live in like this more urban sort of context, and I think like a lot of my views have shifted a little bit. But at the end of the day, like I very much have this sort of like libertarian mindset of like as much as possible, let people live their lives, don't get in the way. And so we are looking like one of the things that I look at is like, well, what are ways that I can actually leverage my skills, my expertise, the things that I care about to have an impact on people in my life? Because I don't necessarily trust that like the government is going to solve all these problems for us, nor do I think it should in a lot of cases. So I'm very passionate about things like one of the things that I think is really interesting is the idea of trying to address the wealth inequality in our country. And so like I know somebody who is a Black man who is from Denver. The first house that he purchased said on the deed of the house, "Do not sell to Negroes." And obviously he was able to buy this, but like this is not like ancient history. This is like he bought a house in a neighborhood in Denver that was built in the 1910s, 1920s. And so like the reality is that in our country there's really like deep seated issues with things like property ownership. And I think that plays out a lot into like if you look at the wealth gap in our country, there's a wealth gap in demographics oftentimes, and there's urban versus rural and all these kinds of things. But like at the end of the day, like literally people were not allowed to own property, and that has a massive carry through to where we sit today. And so I like one of the things that I am looking at is like, okay, what would it look like for me to build a business someday where renters become property owners? And so it kind of is like reversing some of this historical gap where somebody who maybe doesn't come from a family that owned property and isn't getting an inheritance and all of these kinds of things can rent a piece of property or rent from an apartment building for 50 years, but walk away with $500,000 or $1 million in equity because they did pay into that and created value and equity, right? So things like that, I think, are like what I'm really looking at in terms of how can I use my skills long term to benefit the broader public. So also, if anybody's in real estate and wants to do that, let me know. I'll just give you my my vision. May not work, but the reality is that there's it's such a big problem that I don't care if 100 people try to solve this problem, it's still going to barely put a dent in it. So
totally, it's a very interesting way of solving that problem, and I like that. It would be, I hope you or somebody tries that, because I think that's I don't know if it's been done before, but it's very interesting. To your point, like if they're paying in over a period of time, could they have fractional ownership of some sort of this, right? And so it's like, maybe it could be 10 different people over the course of 10 years that have rented this, but it's like, well, when the house sells, it's like they should be able to get a portion of it. I really like that concept.
Yeah, and I mean, just to kind of dive in slightly deeper on that, I don't want to get into too much detail, but at the end of the day, like the cost of the cost to a landlord are vacancy and needing to make repairs. And the longer you keep somebody in a unit, the less those costs are. And so like the cost of vacancy is 8%. The cost of maintenance and repairs, I don't know exactly what that is. It differs for every unit, right? But like there's a percentage there as well. So what if you could say, if you rent this property, this unit, whatever it is, house, apartment, unit, doesn't really matter, for $2,000 a month, you get 5% of that in equity if you are a good renter. So you pass an inspection each year, or you get bonuses for re-upping your lease, so there's no vacancy, like those kinds of things. Like I think there's a world in which the landlord still makes their money, but you also create wealth for the person who is staying in that unit. And maybe you actually have an impact on if there's less vacancy and less people moving between units, maybe there's more housing for everybody in that context too. So there's some interesting things where it's like, the government will never come to that conclusion. It's just not the way that it's going to work. So when we talk about like the issue of like government versus people solving things, that will never be the solution that the government comes up with, because it just doesn't work. Like, and you can't mandate that people do that.
Mandate that.
Yeah. Right. But me as an individual, I can go out and I can try that, and I can try to like sacrifice some of my wealth potential in order for somebody else to have wealth as well.
I think that's very much the libertarian mindset to a point, right? And I actually share that with you as well. I consider myself libertarian. It's the one that I think I the most closely align with, although there's always going to be, any affiliation is never going to completely be what you want.
For sure.
But the quote that I like that goes along with what you just said that I've always appreciated is, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. The reason why I love that is because, to your point, if you mandate that, it's just not going to change somebody's mind. Landlords aren't going to. Now you might be able to get something to happen, but they will find ways to circumvent. Like it will just create more than it is. Versus,
they're gonna cut corners. They're gonna there's gonna be things that are done where like it still is not a net benefit to the person who should be benefiting in the context.
Right, and so get the government out of that and just encourage innovative, compassionate people to be able to come up with ideas like what you just did, and then have the ability for them to execute on them. And I think that's huge. Yeah,
for sure.
Jeremiah, it's been absolutely amazing talking to you. You've shared a lot of wisdom with us, funny stories, inspirational stories here. If people are listening and they want to work with you or follow you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so best way, find me on LinkedIn or Twitter. That's just at Jeremiah Prummer, all one word. And then Jeremiah@KnoCommerce.com. You can email me there as well. I actually get way more emails than I get messages on social media. So those you're more likely for me to actually miss, because hundreds a day, it happens. Send me a message on social media and I will almost certainly see it. So
that's fair. Well, again, I appreciate you sharing your time and wisdom with us here today. For everyone else joining in, thank you for listening. Hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, man.
Thanks for listening to the Up Arrow Podcast with William Harris. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.